I have oftentimes asked God to do something for me. How many times I've prayed and I've asked the Lord earnestly for something, and I'm surprised when the answer comes. It's kind of stupid, isn't it? Like, why'd you bother praying then if you're going to be surprised about the one who's going to answer? But other times I've prayed for something, and the answer hasn't been what I've asked for. And I can say specifically that there have been things that I've prayed for that I know that the answer, well, let's just put it to you this way. God answered, but he didn't answer the way I had expected. And so sometimes it's hard to understand when we've prayed and asked for something, and seemingly it's according to God's will, why God says no. I preached a message one time about when God says no. And I guess the important thing is our attitude. You know, God can deal with our human frame because he knows that's just what we are, dust, clay. Paul called us earthen vessels. He knows exactly how we are. The thing I think God doesn't desire to deal with is people who cannot be brought to a certain humility about the one who we say we serve. Just recently, in the last few months, somebody made a comment to me about the God I serve. And that really, it was very cutting to me that someone would make a comment. In other words, first of all, the same individual said that essentially only weak people can be Christians because strong men and women do not need any form of religion. Leave that to your own understanding. There's a paradox in Christianity. We are weak, but we are strong. We are made strong. When we are weak, when we're brought to the understanding of our weaknesses, then we are strong in him. But this individual also made a comment about the fact that the God that I serve, and the comment was based on the fact that essentially, if you want to believe this fairy tale God that you serve, and, you know, I won't give you the rest of the conversation, but it was like somebody had stuck a knife in my heart because I was thinking, you poor fool, you have no clue, but you will one day. When you're standing there and the Lord asks you, why didn't you listen? You will one day. I believe, I should preach a message on heaven and hell. I believe that there will be a time for every creature under the sun to answer. Good, bad, ugly, in between, it doesn't matter. We shall all stand and give account. If you don't want to believe that, we shall see, my friends. But the comment about the God you serve, your God, really struck me. And I think about the God I serve. There's a really clear roadmap about this one that I have tried to know better, tried to follow. God will do according to his purpose. Now, God enters into all things to work his good. There's going to be times in your life and in mine where we pray for God to do something. And when the answer comes that is different than the thing we would hope for, the attitude that is essentially what comes along with an answer to prayer, which is not the answer we hope for, should bring a certain humility into our lives that makes us recognize he is God and we are not. And lucky that we have such a gracious God who puts up with our feeble fumblings and even our feeble petitions, which most of the time are full of self-indulgent wishes for things that have nothing really pertaining to his greater good and plan in our lives. If you really think about it and you strip back a lot of the praying we do. There's a lot of self-indulgence that happens, and it's very seldom, unless you learn the lesson of David, it's very seldom that we start into prayer by thanking God for exactly who He is, and that He is a merciful God, and that He is a saving, loving, long-suffering God. Thank God for that and for all the benefits and all the blessings and all the other things. Now, Lord, I got this one thing I need you to help me with. Now, what I want to tell you is this passage that I'm going to take you to, some of you already know where I'm going, has been a blessing to me, and I'm going to hope it's going to bless you as well and help you deal with your daily walking with God. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. I guess what bothers me, as I get older, I'm more and more sensitive to the Scriptures. I'm more and more sensitive about the things of God. I don't like to be a weepy person, but I've become more and more sensitive. So when I start to study this passage, I begin to think, how could anybody doubt the Apostle Paul was sent by God? Could any of you here who have read the New Testament read it and doubt that he was sent by God? But in his day, now that shouldn't surprise you, but in his day, people said he's not really who he says he is. Don't you know who this man is? And don't you know what he's done? Well, listen, they said to the master, he's a wine bibber and a glutton. He can't even discern who he sits with. He's sitting with sinners. So an outside world looking in can't even understand this man. And it took him, if you think about it, we know there were 4 parts to the Corinthian letters. We have 1st and 2nd. There must have been 3 and 4 which we don't have. And we can conclude that by other external evidences, which I don't want to get into. But the most important thing here is it took him 14 years to tell what exactly happened to him. And beginning in the first verse of the 12th chapter, he says, "It is not expedient for me, doubtless, to glory. I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord." Listen to the way this reads. "I knew a man in Christ above 14 years ago." That in its own is very interesting. He doesn't come out and say, "It's me," like 14 years ago, blah, blah. He says, "I knew a man," just the way it's stated. "I knew a man in Christ above 14 years ago, whether in the body I cannot tell, or whether out of the body I cannot tell, God knoweth. Such a one caught up to the 3rd heaven. And I knew such a man, whether in the body or out of the body, I cannot tell, God knoweth, how that he was caught up into paradise, and heard unspeakable words which it is not lawful for a man to utter. Of such a one will I glory, yet of myself I will not glory, but in mine infirmities." It took him 14 years, essentially, because it's the first time that he's revealing this here, to share this information. And it's perfectly clear, based on the context of where this occurs in the letter, that he is trying to tell the people to who he is writing that he is not a whit behind the rest of the apostles of Christ. Now, other than people in the Old Testament, and perhaps the Mount of Transfiguration, there is no other example like this in the New Testament. Or maybe Peter seeing the vision with the sheet come down. There's nothing like this, though, where an individual is caught up. Maybe the only thing like it is John in Revelation talking about what he saw when the voice had come up thither. Who knows? But the only thing I'm saying to you is that when it says about visions and revelations of the Lord, it's interesting that these visions and revelations came at a price for the Apostle Paul. Now, I believe that this passage should be treated with care, because as you read it, he says, of such a one will I glory, yet of myself I will not glory, I will not boast, but in mine infirmities. For though I would desire to glory, I shall not be a fool, for I will say the truth. But now I forbear, lest any man should think of me above that which he seeth me to be, or that he heareth of me. And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations. There was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan, to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. It's repeated twice, above measure, lest I should be exalted above measure, and then again, lest I should be exalted above measure at the close of that 7th verse. Now, what's interesting to me, and it should be interesting to each and every one of us, because there's some degree of this message which is applicable universally to every Christian believer. Here's a man, obviously, who understood, we'll call it the buffetings of life as a Christian. And if you think about it, here's a man who's been through much. His first encounter, we meet him in the book of Acts. He's persecuting the believers. He's yet still referred to as Saul. And when Stephen is stoned, after he preaches that beautiful sermon, Stephen is stoned, dead. It's Paul, who's holding the cloak of Stephen. And I often think to myself, if people would just follow the pattern of this man and realize that this is a tough, hardened person in many ways, of the things that he lived through and the things that he did before his encounter with Christ on the Damascus Road. And then after that, his journey, we'll call it a journey of credibility. When he first comes to the one who could heal him of his blind eyes because he was blinded, could not see after the encounter with Christ, the question of, is this man for real? Is he really, or is this a con? Essentially, I'm giving you the colloquial version. Should we even believe this man, because considering his former behavior? And I find it interesting that too many Christians will talk about and focus on his Damascus Road experience, but they will not focus on the fact of the things that he suffered after that experience. You know what it's like, and you all know what it's like, because this is not a traditional church. For people to ask you about where you attend church and to have a discussion, and because their church is more traditional or it's in some type of format that is socially acceptable, you can come under some type of criticism. Well, is this really a church? Because we don't do this and we don't do that and we don't do these other things. Just like Paul being questioned whether or not he was really sent by God, many of you often questioned. In fact, I think there's more arguments about this church between loved ones, friends, and family, because there is a lack of understanding of what this church is. And I've heard husbands and wives and families being divided over this because they expect church to be, and they'll fill in the blanks. And I've told you, if you take a page out of the Bible, take a look at Paul, who was turned around. He was persecuting the believers who were following Christ. He was going the wrong way. God turned him around. He was not living a perfect life. He was living zealously as a Jew, for God, but he was not living the life that he was intended to live until he had that encounter with Christ. And then the things that he suffered afterwards. And it was constant. And everywhere this man went, people were either fighting because his preaching caused riots in the street, or people were talking against him, speaking against him. Gangs, which often occur in churches, but gangs of people who could not believe that this one was sent by God, all the way to being bound in prison, sent off on his way to Rome, being shipwrecked, being bitten by a snake. If you catalog all the things that this man went through, And I really believe it was all in a perfect design to bring out greater exaltation, greater humility. It all had a design. And I pity people who cannot wrap their mind around this. All Scripture is given for our instruction and also for our encouragement. We should be encouraged. I don't think you've been shipwrecked of late. You may feel like it, but I don't think you have of late. I don't think you've been bitten by a snake, maybe one or two of you in the course of your lifetime, maybe. But we haven't gone through the beatings and the imprisonments and all the things that Paul went through, yet we go through enough situations that if we look at what is being said here, we can definitely walk away and understand the frustration on the part of the apostle as he's declaring this thing to these people. He says, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan, to buffet me. And I've said before, as I've taught on this buffeting, think of it as being knocked with the fist. It's not enough. The buffeting is not enough to completely knock you out, but it's enough to knock you and shake you side to side. It's enough to be annoying. You know, if you've ever had some type of sparring, either verbal or physical, you know that after a while, the verbal sparring, by the way, is the same thing. After a while, injuries occur. In the verbal sparring, it's emotional scars. In the physical, it's going to be, wow, I'm sore. That hurts now. Stop it. If you understand what I'm saying, after a while, you're going to start feeling everything. There is nothing worse than an insensitive, I have to say this again, there is nothing worse than an insensitive person, someone who cannot and will not be sensitive about your faith or your commitment. Now, Satan doesn't care, by the way. He doesn't choose. He's not here. He sent a messenger to buffet, not worried about offending Paul or hurting Paul, but not enough damage to completely wipe him out, but enough that whatever that thorn was, it was enough to harass, to annoy, to constantly be there, to the fact where he says he prayed 3 times. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. 3 times. Now you might say, well, that's not very much praying. Only three times? But the idea, when I preached this the last time, I put some words in my margin. One of them is frustration. Not only persistent pressure, but frustration that this thing is not going away. Now, this thing not going away may be your landlord or your husband or wife or ex or something. Could be a messenger of Satan. You know, people have a funny mindset about this. But we're talking about something that was, it says, given unto him a thorn in the flesh. Something that was enough. We're not talking about going over to a rose bush and, you know, you get a thorn. Yeah, oh, that really, really hurts, but you can remove it. It's something that he had to ask the Lord to remove. Something that the Lord had to do. Oh, we've all had something like that. Lord, take this thing out of my life. Lord, please remove the pressure. I can't take it. Now, if there's just one person in this room that has been there, then I'm preaching to that one person, but my guess is there's way more than one. The frustration of this man, because he's praying, and it's the age-old question people ask, what is it? You know, this word for thorn in the Greek is also a word that they used for impaling. So we're talking about something a little bit more serious than just a little jab. But obviously Satan had some concern in it. So the thorn, we might say, to annoy, to afflict, to harass. But I'm going to add something here, and I'm going to call the thorn the teacher of humility first. And why I say the teacher of humility is because sometimes we ask for things They're not granted to us. And we'll only understand these things when we stand in front of him. Why, Lord, you didn't answer? This was according to your will. Is it not according to your will? Because we've succumbed to the common preachments. We've succumbed to modern Christendom's call that every believer should be blessed with everything being okay all the time. That's the modern preachments of this generation. Churches thrive on that. You will see a mass multitude of people showing up to hear about the great blessings. And God does bless, but I'm telling you something. The greatest teacher of humility here is this thorn in the flesh. Now I'm going to go back, and I've said this before. Some people have said the thorn in the flesh was that Paul had ophthalmia. There was something wrong with his eyes. I do not believe that would be reason enough for him to say he besought the Lord thrice, because that would be something that he might continue to pray and to ask for. But I do believe it has much to do with the road he traveled before he had an encounter with Christ on the Damascus Road. And I wish for some of you today to not think of it as the time when you were converted and the time that you knew, because the whole walk of the Christian is at times a repetition. The ebb and flow, as I've said, I've watched people fall away, I've watched people backslide and get overtaken in a fault. Be restored, but on the flip side, just like this man right here, thorn in the flesh, the teacher of humility, may be given over and later, and not just at one point in time in a person's life. You know, the mistake that people say, well, I was saved, and then I was delivered, and then I was sanctified, and then I didn't breathe, and then I was holy. And I can tell you, I've fallen down many times over the years, and I'm talking about since I became a believer. In fact, the falls were worse. I'm speaking my heart to you. I don't care what the listening people think. The falls were worse because when I fell, I actually knew I was displeasing the Lord, versus when I fell previously and had no concept. It didn't bother me because I wasn't even aware of my condition. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, ma'am.
So don't think that the thorn concept or the ministry of the thorn is simply something that might be related solely to one's past. I think in Paul's situation, it has to do with his past. But just remember, the whole life is, as I said, a series of ups and downs. I believe it was him being tormented, buffeted, annoyed, harassed by the fact of what he had done previously, before he had this encounter. Now, what's interesting is the frustration. That was the first word I had in my margin. And the second word that I had in my Bible is revelation. See, God showed him things. This reference back to the 14 years ago where he was transported up and he saw something that no one else is recorded seeing. Maybe the closest thing is John in Revelation to being transported and seeing in the New Testament. And it came at a price. Don't think God's going to give you a revelation of something without it having an impact on your life. And I think just like Hezekiah laying out his petition before God, spreading it out there and laying it out and saying thus, you've got the same type of mindset with Paul, saying he was asking the Lord 3 times. He laid it out there completely. Lord, you know what this is, whatever it is. You know what this is. Lord, please take this away from me. I cannot bear it anymore. I've prayed that prayer several times in my life. Lord, please remove this thing. I can't bear it anymore. In fact, I've prayed it over things and people. That's pretty good. Because some of the people were indeed messengers of Satan. I've prayed, remove this thing from my life, whatever this thing is. Sometimes the Lord has said, you got it? Because It happens really quick. And other times the thing remains. And the response, and he said unto me, this is verse 9, he said unto me, my grace is sufficient. Well, see if I'm reading the same passage. Yes. He said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. And let me just stop there. It's as if while Paul is praying, there is the Lord, forgive me for saying it like this, but in picture form, standing in the shadows, saying, just as I prayed in the garden, Lord, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. But it was the Father's will for the cup to remain, for it was for this cause he came. And it's as though Christ is in the shadows close by to Paul, as Paul prays 3 times for this thing to be removed. And the answer is, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. There's 2 types of revelations being given here. One is the revelation of his petition, and the other one is of the answer. And I would say the answer is somewhat interesting, because the answer is, notice what Christ did not say. Christ did not say, I will give you enough grace to make it. Can you imagine if that was the answer? I'll give you enough grace to make it. Almost like, and not a penny more. But you know, this should be comforting for every single one of us, because I think this is a passage that many of us have turned to in our time of need to understand the sufficiency being referenced, the sufficiency of God. Think of it this way. Do you remember when Andrew, where can we buy bread? 200 pennyworth is not sufficient. And the sufficiency of the loaves and the fishes in the hands of the Lord was enough and more to feed the multitude. That's the type of sufficiency we're talking about. It's as if the pressure and the thorn are to remain, and there is provision for your need over and above what will get you through. Now think about this. Forgive me for doing this. But in picture type, we're like ants. We're as small as ants, moving around, going about our business. If you think of the grandeur of God and the greatness of God, and we worry about, will it be enough for the one who is all around, greater, higher, lower, wider, impossible to even fathom the magnitude. And we question whether or not it will be enough. And that's why it's the perfect response. My grace is sufficient for thee. In other words, now Paul is not an ant by any means, but if you look at it that way, it's like a little ant saying, is this provision going to get me through, when the largesse of God is saying it's enough and over and beyond. It's kind of ludicrous if you think about it. And just in the economy of God, he knows exactly what we need and provides for the situation and beyond. Now, most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me, may occupy me. There's the confirmation, if you will. And what I love about this is that there's a change from the petition and the take this thing away to a mindset that says, most gladly, therefore, I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power, I'd rather be endued with power in my weakness. Think about that. How many times have you really registered in your crisis and in your circumstance, you're weak? Oh, the statement that this person made, Christianity's for weak people. Well, there was a little part truth in that, which is when you come to acknowledge, what did Christ say in the Beatitudes? Blessed are the poor. He's talking about those in spirit, for they shall be. And then you come to the conclusion, that whosoever is not poor in spirit, who cannot understand what this means, can never receive the riches of Christ, can never understand the blessing that comes out of the understanding that we are just paupers before Him, in need of receiving from Him at His hand, and therefore, like Paul, I'd rather glory in my infirmities. I'd rather glory in the fact, although it doesn't please me, not often, God will make a way for me in the condition and state I am in. Does that not sound like Paul saying, I've learned to be content? Accepting, not saying I'm going to now be overabundantly happy about the state I'm in, but rather I know God's got the situation under control, and whatever the outcome may be, and the answer may not be what I want, but if the answer comes by God's hand. Now, let's just take a look at this for a minute, because God didn't say to Paul, Jesus didn't say to Paul, yeah, I'll remove that thorn. There's a passage in the scriptures that says, I think it's Psalm 106, where it says that God gave them the request of their heart, but He sent leanness into their soul. I don't think I would want to pray for that. In other words, to pray for something and to keep praying and to keep praying and to keep praying. Well, God, grant the thing that I'm asking for, but send leanness into my soul. I'd rather have the fullness of God and not have the thing that I'm asking for than to have the Master remove His presence from me. And notice what is not done here. The thorn is not taken away, and there's several bullet points I want to make here. The lesson of faith in the thorn. That sometimes I think God just will stand back and watch our reaction as something is given to us at His hand, or not. It's a difficult thing to actually come to grips with something, some circumstance, some crisis, something is happening in your life, and nothing is changing. I get messages all the time, letters all the time from people who are homeless and on the street, people's lives that are falling apart. This is why I have no tolerance for that Pharisaical one that said about your God, because obviously there's a lack of understanding. God comes to the people when they are broken. He comes to us when we realize we cannot fix. He picks us up when we realize we cannot pick ourselves up. So in that case, in that respect, the lesson of faith here about the thorn is that God will enter in, but it may not be the way I had hoped for. Christ can use this trouble for a purpose. Let's go back to what I said I perceive this thorn, this messenger, this thorn is. Let's hypothesize for a minute, and every scholar has some theory about what this thorn could be. I'm telling you what I've stuck to my story over the years and said, I have to believe it was his conscience about the things that he did before to persecute the church, including, by the way, accessory to the murder in the stoning of Stephen. Because he just stood by, he held the coat, stood by and watched, and didn't do a thing about it. But let's just assume for a minute that it's a guilty conscience dealing with things of the past. And you take this idea, Christ can use this trouble for a purpose. And the purpose is very simple. God will have the glory in what has happened. Not in the fact that acts or deeds or whatever it is that has created the guilty conscience, that's created the mind that is overtaken with what happened in the past, but God will be glorified in having entered into the recognition on the part of the one whose life has been changed and affected, which is why, by the way, the message of the resurrection is important, because when you stop to think about every single follower of Christ that is given in our records fled at the cross, and all were changed, then you have to come to some very important conclusions about what Christ will do using these, we'll call them thorn episodes. In Peter's case, take a look at what happened to him. His foretold denial and betrayal was turned into something else to glorify the power of God. So when you begin to think about that, this is what I think, I hope people will take away from this. It's not always, oh, I was praying and I asked the Lord for this and the Lord gave me that and then the Lord said and then he gave me that some more. But sometimes the answer is going to be this: my grace is sufficient for thee. And in some place there has to be a recognition that if God is, and he is the rewarder, by the way, of those that seek him diligently, there has to be an understanding that, yes, he does want what's best for his children, including the breaking, the training, the building up of faith, the increasing of understanding of who he is and how he works, and not according to the way we think it ought to happen. The next thing, of course, is the assurance. And the assurance is that the Lord's provisions will be enough. How many of you have worried that the Lord's, come on now, be honest, that the Lord's provisions won't be enough? Okay? That's what we call the no Scabala zone here, okay? Yeah, you come to worry that it's not going to be enough. You're not going to make it. The Lord won't be able to cover it. Think of how stupid that is. I mean, in the moment that you say it, in the moment you utter it, it's not. It's a reality for you, but it's really stupid when you think about it, because you say, he owns me. I belong to him. I'm a child of God. So you either have a warped sense of your heavenly Father, that he doesn't care enough to take care of you. Now, when I say he knows what you need, it means he knows what you need, not what you think you need sometimes. I've said this before. This is why we're supposed to cast our cares upon him, because you matter to him. And that beautiful passage in the Gospels that talks about this very thing. Consider the birds, how they are fed. Consider what God does in nature, and you're worried about this. This is why he says, don't be concerned about food or clothing. But I can't help it. I got to be concerned. I got to be anxious. I can't help it. Then I'd have nothing else to think about, right? So we have some things here to consider. The issue at hand, learning humility at the Lord's doing. Now, it doesn't mean if we ask for something and it is not, that we should stop praying after 3 times. The woman that's recorded in the Gospels that kept going back, and she kept going back, and she kept going back, and I think God was like, okay, enough already. The only way to shut this woman up is to do something for her, right? And maybe that will be your tactic and mine as well. But my point is, sometimes when the answer comes, it's also learning humility of how to deal with it. I think a lot of times God gives us these faith opportunities that they're not seen as such, but when the answer comes, by the way we handle and deal with it, I'm not saying that a tragedy should be accepted and embraced and, well, this is the Lord's will. But when we are asking him for something, the answer may come a different way. And there's plenty of people, by the way, in this book that have had similar things where they ask for something and something else happens. You know, the send me, Lord, and then, well, you're not going to be sent to people who can hear you. How do you like that for your first preaching assignment? Now, the reason why I really believe that these are important things to put in your Bible is because the last one I have labeled as transformation. Because he recognizes, he'd rather glory in his infirmities, that the power, the dunamis of Christ may tent upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, reproaches, necessities, persecutions, distresses for Christ's sake. Not for my sake, not for some super martyrdom hero's sake, but for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. There's the transformation right there. So, he started praying about and then stopped praying about the thorn because there's a transformation, a switching of gears that went from the scene and the circumstance and the felt and whatever it was that was indeed that thorn to the essential recognition that God's provision of grace would be sufficient enough to take Paul through whatever he was going to go through. And this is why I call this the ministry of the thorn. And what I would hope it would mean for you and for me. You see, I think as I move on in my walk, I'm a little less cocky. I'm a lot more aware that God is super patient. I mean, when I say super, it's got to be stretched out super patient a billion times over. Let me give the spirit of exaggeration. If I could paint the words super patient, I'd need all the paint in the world to make it as large as his patience is. And have I believe, a great understanding that even the best saint, forgive me for doing that, as in, what is that? What does that mean, the best saint? God has been overly patient with and has given us the opportunities to recognize something at his hand. You've heard me reference this in past weeks, like Job, speaking in reference to what his wife said, curse God and die. And he says, should we only take the blessings and not take the lesser things? They all come from God's hand. And what I'm saying to you is perhaps within this ministry of the thorn, the answer that I would hope is a transformation about how we see God's dealing with us, where humility comes. I am so grateful that God had me listen to Dr. Scott, because I could have sat somewhere else. He used to say about humility, first of all, a truly humble man or woman doesn't turn back to look and ask, was that humble or did that look humble? And you get to become humble and experience humility by the things you suffer and go through in life. Some of them are outward, absolute, wow, that was so humiliating, I can't believe that. And others are less, they're more interior recognitions of things that you have blatantly done before God. It's a private understanding, if you will, in the conscious awareness of being in the state of sinning man or woman before God. Wow, I can't believe that. And what I'm saying to you is that the lesson here, the transformation to just switch gears a little bit, is if we can take what comes at God's hand and be transformed by it. And maybe as we get on in our walk, as time goes on, I'm not suggesting it's instantaneous and it happens right away, but as we go on in our walk, we're more concerned with the coming under experience and the transformation experience than we are eventually about the frustrations of the things that God has not done, because there are abundantly more things that God has done for you than the things he has not. Just stop to think about that for a minute. What's the one thing that you might have been focusing on? Please, Lord, take this thing away. Why aren't you taking this away? But not focusing on all the other things the Lord has done creates that mindset that stays stuck with what I would call the absolute disease of the soul, pride. Could you at least do this for me, God? As if he's not done enough. You sing a song, what more do you want him to do? And that's about the bottom line. I can deal with anybody on any level, but the thing I cannot deal with, and I believe that it's just a little speck of sand that has a trait of understanding about God. I cannot deal with people who are so proud, so full of pride, that they cannot humble themselves before God, or let God, better yet, humble them and take those experiences and turn around and say, his grace is sufficient over and above what I need to get through this thing. I reference back to the fish and the loaves. There was leftovers. Think of it that way. There's going to be leftovers in the grace department for the thing you're praying for. There'll be leftovers, buckets probably picked up of the leftovers of the grace. If you can take the experience just as Paul did, and that's why I said that this ministry of the thorn, for the thing that is not being removed, and for the thing that has not gone away. Now, for some people, that may be a permanent bodily injury. That may be a health condition, a sickness. Could be a state of mind. It could be anything. And the mistake we often make is saying, well, this should happen. This should be my experience. No, maybe God is using this one thing to make your eyes be a little bit more open to the fact that He's the boss, you're not. Then when we start getting that message, because there's way too many people that come into the church, they still think they're the boss. Or they'll say, what do you think, Pastor Scott? You're the boss? Well, I'm the under shepherd. But I have a definite awareness that He's the boss. He's the one that gets to decide. I've told you the matter of the church. If this is His work, and if you are His workmanship, then the burden of the problem of navigating this church has to be, and it has been very humbling, believe me, that whatever He metes out will be sufficient because this is His work. It's not a work of man. People think, there's some human element here. I've said to you, yeah, of course there's always going to be, because we interfere. Our flesh gets in the way of everything. Sorry. You may not like that, but that's just the way it is. But He said, my grace is sufficient. I don't know what you're going through today. I don't know what your experience or your circumstances. I want you to leave here today. If you've been asking God to help you with something, I don't want you to just resign and say, well, that's it. God's not going to do anything, because I asked Him and Pastor said God might say no. But I want you to have the mindset, you'll keep asking, but whatever comes at His hand, you'll receive with joy, knowing one thing. If you are His and you belong to Him, He does want the best for you, but it's not the best as in the human frame of reference that says, well, we define the best as being this. Material blessings, this, whatever the blessings are, but rather, this is the thing that He has ordained for your life. Could I go back 25 or 30 years, and let's just say 25, and I would be potentially praying, and if I had the mindset back then to be asking God for direction and for His will and for guidance, could I imagine that I would be here doing this? I've told you, hell no. Not part of the equation. But then once this happened, I have this journey that I began, which did not begin with humility. It began with the sadness of heart, what I had to contend with. And now I realize, I even look at the church and I apply it both in my personal life and to the church. One of the most humiliating things for me was to watch the work being eroded by people who professed to be a part of a body of uncommon men and women. You've heard me lament this for how many years now? And humiliating because the whole onlooking world, we were on nationwide TV, and the whole onlooking world was busy kind of snickering, saying, how long is this freak show going to last? While we were on nationwide TV, there was a whole war going on within the church, and it became a humiliation for me to watch people who should have been warriors, who should have been Christ-like, who should have had the mind of the Lord, just disappear. And maybe the things that were being said would actually come to fruition. And I realized, even in that moment, God had to enter in. God had to put His hand somewhere in the mix. But maybe it wouldn't be the way I envisioned it. Concerning His work, it was humiliating to me to watch a church that had been so vibrant, that had fought so hard for so many things, so many battles, and suddenly the battle of a lifetime had so many people, cowards, running away. That was humiliating for me. And I think it was probably a great experience given to me as somewhat of a thorn, and then with that, the spin-off of those people. I've had personal things that I would call thorns, and I made some kind of funny remarks that seemed half serious and maybe half joking, where I've asked God, please, I want you to take this thing away from me. And I'm not talking about the church, by the way. I haven't prayed that. Not yet, anyway. But what I'm trying to say to you is, that's why I think I've become a little bit more, I said weepy or tender about God's Word, because I realized something. The lessons that are contained here are the lessons not just of a revelation of Paul about his frustration, about the revelation he came to know and receive, the confirmation of Christ giving him those words, but a transformation, which is what the church is supposed to represent. Not I change because I can, but in the process, he's changing me. I trust him. He's changing me. And the transformation for Paul, he says, when I'm weak, then I'm strong. I'm saying to you, maybe the church does its best in a weakened and buffeted state. Maybe the church does its best when we are on our knees crying out to God. And when the church is prospering and doing well, therein lies the danger. We can't even see the thorn or the humility, the lessons of faith that come with it. What I'd like you to leave here with today is something that I've been saying for weeks in different ways at different times. God has not forgotten about you. You may think you cannot bear the pressure. You may think that somehow, because you became a child of God, that expressly now there should be no thorns. Maybe like Paul, we ought to say, this is something I will take. The Lord chose to answer me in a different way, but friends, he chose to answer Paul, and he's still choosing to answer you, and the answer may be for you and for me today, my grace is sufficient. It doesn't mean and period, and it ends there, but my grace is well more than enough, with buckets left over, just like the bread, to take you through. And the ministry of the thorn might be difficult for you, but it will produce greater understanding of how God works with us to bring us more into the image and likeness of Christ. So I don't know who this message is for today, but I want to say, don't give up on praying. Don't give up on asking. Don't give up on the fact that God may just be waiting for that one more prayer, one more time, just one final, Lord, please, because it's the 1,001 or the 10,001 time you've asked. But look as well to your attitude. The things you receive at God's hand may bring you into a greater, sweeter, and more tender relationship with Him, and the recognition that He does indeed care about you, and His grace indeed is sufficient. That's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.